The Mexican American Legislative Caucus from El Paso, Jeannie Hinojosa from Austin, and Armando Walek from Houston. We will be joined later by Diana Arevalo from San Antonio, and also Celia Israel from Austin. I would invite the members of this hearing to present any opening statements to the extent that they would like to. And make sure you turn on your microphone.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for everyone for being here. At the end of the day, these are people's lives. These are kids' lives. These are families' lives. And so it is important for us to be transparent, to hold people accountable, to think critically about how to create solutions, because this is not the country or the state that I believe in. I love Texas. I one day may have children, although I think I have a date first. But one day may have children, and I want them to be proud of the state. I want them to look back and think that we have a beautiful history, not a tainted history. And this is a moment in time where we can really change history and make sure that we don't have a black mark, or a continued black mark, because I would argue that we already do. And so thank you to the chairman. Thank you to all the staff who made this happen. This doesn't happen because people just woke up one day and said it should happen. It came because of a lot of hard work of our advocates, of members, of staff. So we just of everyone who's paying attention. So for today is about transparency, accountability, shared knowledge, and really for there to be a public conversation, right? That everybody, whether it's in this room, on the dais, or in the public watching, will have the same information. So collectively, collaboratively, we can truly address the needs of children, right? Of children. So thank you so much for everyone being here.
And I believe I committed an oversight in not presenting any comments in Spanish para los miembros del público que estén aquí, que prefieren recibir su información en español. Aquí dominamos los idiomas, afortunadamente, y muchos de nosotros somos o inmigrantes o hijos de inmigrantes, así es que estamos muy enfocados en ustedes, la comunidad inmigrante. Tenemos representantes de grupos de servicios sociales, también de abogados. Y tenemos inmigrantes aquí que van a proveer sus testigos, su experiencia sobre cómo han sido tratados por no solamente el gobierno federal, pero el gobierno estatal. Y para personas que quieran enviarnos preguntas, se pueden apuntar atrás y nada más deletrear su pregunta. Esas preguntas van a ser traídas al comité para que nosotros también podamos responder. Say that in English as well. If you have any questions, there are small note cards. We'll do some Q&A to the extent we can answer it after the hearing. And so if you want to write your questions down, staff will take those questions and bring them up to us. Again, we're grateful. Representative Hinojosa, any comments for the audience and for those watching at home?
Well, I just want to give the perspective of kind of the human perspective as a mother with children at home, luxuriating in the freedom, the carelessness of doing nothing. And I gave my son Pablo the task of organize your toys. That's his job right now. And to think that there are children in this country, in this state, who was reported recently by a U.S. senator, who are being caged, children as young as 4, 5, 6 years old, who are being caged and kept at the border. And I just think I want to thank the leadership of MALC for organizing this hearing, and all the advocates and those who are providing their personal testimony on this issue, because even aside from the policymaking aspect of this is a human rights and an issue of human decency, and we need to understand what's going on in this country and in this state. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Representative Walek.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the only thing I would add would be that I want to thank the panelists, the advocates that are here. I'm here to listen, and somebody that comes from a very large immigrant population in Houston, you see the diversity of the Latino community, not just it being 5th, 6th, 7th generation Mexican American, but also the influx of Central American folk into Houston and to Dallas, but particularly in our region that has a large Central American population. And is also wearing a different hat as a practitioner in the law and listening to the stories there in the facility. It's not a detention center. It is baby jail. It's I call it baby jail, and having played with children in that facility, it really solidifies our commitment as a caucus to shed light on these stories and to the response has been inadequate in the sense that the response has from a federal, from a state, and some jurisdictions, local level like Arizona, Sheriff Arpaio, that response at those levels have had a negative impact on our communities. And so I'm just here to listen, but I just wanted to tell you my experience as a practitioner, as a policymaker, but also practitioner in the law that I've witnessed the stories as well, and it's something that we should continue to shed light on, and I appreciate our caucus taking a leadership role in this matter. So thank you for those that are listening as well, and look forward to the testimony.
Thank you, Representative Wale, and with that, we'll call up our first panel, and I will introduce you and do my best on everyone's name. But we will be hearing first from Manoj Govindaya. He's with Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services, and followed by representatives from Raíces. We've got Sara Ramey with the Migrant Center, and we also have Claudia Loli and Yuridia Loera, both with United We Dream. And not everybody, if you simply want to respond to questions and not testify, that is completely understandable. But those of you who want to testify, we'd love to hear from you. Manoj, if you can get us started.
Sure. Thank you so much for convening this. My name is Manoj Govindaya. I'm the Director of Family Detention Services at the Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services, known as Raíces. Each year, Raíces provides legal services to thousands of detained adults, unaccompanied minors, and families throughout Texas. I'm here today to offer context and clarification on statements and actions recently taken by the Trump administration that affect immigrant children and families. First, I'd like to discuss the Office of Refugee Resettlement's recent statements that the agency lost approximately 1,500 unaccompanied minors. As the caucus members may know, when an immigrant child is present in the United States without a parent available to provide care and custody, the child is classified as unaccompanied and transferred to the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. ORR is charged with caring for the children until they are released from custody to a sponsor. Upon release, the child continues with their immigration case. They have court hearings at their local immigration court. They have regular appointments with an ICE deportation officer assigned to their case. They will also be attending school and, just like any other child, participating in community activities. So the children that ORR described are not actually lost. 30 days after release, ORR is required to call each child and administer a survey to see how they're doing. If the child doesn't participate in the survey, meaning maybe they didn't answer the phone, ORR is choosing to categorize them as lost. Except in the rarest of cases, ORR does not provide any other services once a child is released. If a child moves or changes their phone number, they're required to inform ICE and they're required to inform the immigration court, but they're not required to inform ORR. So ORR may not know where these kids are, but ICE knows where they are, and the immigration judge is expecting them to appear in court, and their communities and their families are supporting them. If a released child is in danger or experiencing trouble in their home, community-based social service agencies are the appropriate entity to help them. The last thing that immigrant children and their families want or need is more federal intervention in their lives. The next thing I'd like to discuss is a recent cut in funding. Raíces, along with 12 other nonprofit legal services organizations throughout the country, receives funding to provide free legal services to children that have been released from ORR custody. About 2 weeks ago, Raíces was informed that we could no longer accept new cases under this stream of funding, effectively terminating our ability to continue providing in-house free legal services to release children. This cut in legal services is extremely troubling, or funding for legal services. As you all know, immigration law is one of the most complicated bodies of law in the United States, and the government's own statistics confirm that representation is vital to navigating immigration court proceedings, especially for young children. Access to representation is one of the best ways to ensure that a child stays involved in their case and understands the importance of this process, which helps the child avoid becoming lost. And yet the Trump administration, in a play on words, has determined that a large group of released children are lost, and then is taking away one of the primary possibilities that they had to secure legal representation. We believe this is all an effort to create a narrative to support increased and prolonged detention of children. To put all of this, the impact of all of these changes in context, I want to discuss the situation of one particular family that was separated, but now has successfully reunified and is living here in Austin. Dora, a pseudonym to protect her identity, and her 7-year-old daughter entered the United States last summer. Federal officials separated the family shortly after their apprehension without any explanation. Dora recalls her daughter crying and screaming when the officers took her from her mother. Dora was transferred to the Port Isabel Detention Center, an adult detention center in the Valley, and her daughter was transferred to ORR custody. It took nearly a year before they would see each other again. Dora eventually won asylum, and she got released to her family in Austin. But because they were separated and in different locations, Dora's daughter had her own immigration court case, separate from her mom's, with a different judge and in a different court. Once she got released from ORR custody, her court case was transferred to the San Antonio Immigration Court, where it's still continuing, even though her mom won asylum. Although this family was separated last year, before the Trump administration's recent actions, the family saga offers a clear example of what we can expect to come from the current zero-tolerance criminal prosecution policy that is resulting in separations. The administration, by taking children away from their parents, is creating unaccompanied children. They're then putting them into ORR custody and then cutting off access to representation. And despite clear and widely publicized backlogs of cases, case processing times in immigration courts, the separation of families leads to an unnecessary duplication of cases, with children and their parents having separate cases, separate courts, separate judges, separate lawyers, even though the entire process could be completed together. But most importantly, as this family's case demonstrates, separating families only exacerbates trauma in a population that has experienced violence so severe that they were forced to flee their countries and engage in the difficult and dangerous journey for safety, only to enter the United States and then be torn apart by the Trump administration. Thank you so much. I welcome your questions.
Thank you. Members, any questions? Representative Gonzalez.
Thank you very much for your very powerful testimony. I have a couple of questions. For context and clarification, kind of like you started. So I really appreciated the way you highlighted that the 1,500 children aren't really lost. It's just a system kind of glitch. However, just for clarification, there has been news reports talking about how some of these children were given to human traffickers. Can you clarify around that those news reports? Are they accurate, inaccurate to your knowledge? I'm not saying that everything needs to change, but what are your thoughts on this?
Sure. So I wonder if you might be referring to reports from a couple years. I mean, I know there's reports now, for sure. I know there are reports from a couple years ago, I think in 2016, where a group of children were released to an egg farm, I think in Ohio, where they were trafficked. Since that unfortunate incident, ORR has put in place additional screenings and trackings to try to ensure that children are going to safe environments. So somebody, a family member or a family friend who wants to sponsor a child to get released from ORR custody has to jump through many hoops. They have to do background checks. Actually, everybody that lives in that house, whether relative or not, has to do background checks. They have to provide proof of their income to demonstrate that they can support the child. If they're not a family member, they have to have written consent from the parent before the child can be released to them. And then additionally, ORR is doing these 30-day phone calls after release. These systems are not perfect, for sure. But I think my biggest concern is that in the ORR is a social services agency. It's not a law enforcement agency. And yet, in this current administration, it is more and more looking like a law enforcement agency. The director of ORR has no child welfare experience. ORR recently signed a memorandum of understanding with ICE to share additional information on the sponsors who are applying to receive these kids. So I really do think for the safety of the family, and there may be undocumented family members living in that home, the best option is to ensure that the families and the communities that these kids are now living in are taking care of them and supporting them.
Right, I think that's very important information, so I appreciate that. 3 more questions. So you talked about the cut in funding in regards to the work that you do to help kids in the system basically out, right? And so where did that cut funding come from? I'm going to ask 3 of them so you can, where did it come from? How much funding are we talking about? And without that funding, what happens now to these kids and these families? So
the funding was, the cut in funding, the direction to cut the funding came from the administration. It's not a chunk of funding. We actually do the work and they get reimbursed. We estimate that for the rest of this fiscal year, we will probably lose about $100,000. That's Raíces specifically, not all the other organizations nationwide. And that in the next fiscal year, we will probably be losing around $300,000. In terms of what happens to those kids, that's what we are also trying to sort out. We had actually contacted, I think, 8 children about 3 weeks ago to get them into our office for consultations, presuming we could provide free services under this funding. And then just a few days after that, we received the notice that this kind of funding is effective immediately. And now we've had to go back to those kids and say, we may not be able to provide free services to you, but we'd still like to meet with you and see if we could provide some other kind of legal service to you, maybe at a fee or through some other means. So I think as the administration continues to cut on access to representation, we continue to fundraise to try to make up that difference. But I think we are likely, unfortunately, to see more children being forced to retain private counsel, which often they and their families cannot afford, or moving through the process without any representation.
Thank you very much for all your work that you do.
Members, any further questions?
Just a quick question. Do you have any sense of how many children aren't represented by counsel? Because you always hear reports, or not here, but you read reports in every publication, and there's always a picture of the little child with their feet dangling in a courtroom setting against, all the powers that be that hold basically their lives and, her lives in their hands. Do we have a sense of how many kids actually don't get representation? Because it is hard, even if you do have representation, to prove that you can, to prove your case for relief, right?
Right.
In this case, probably asylum or SIJ or whatever other relief they might get, but those are the 2 that I know.
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head. I know that the Immigration, or the Executive Office for Immigration Review, does provide statistics on the number of people in immigration court with lawyers and without lawyers. I'd be happy to get that information to you after the fact. I can tell you that when children are in federal custody, they do have access to legal services. They get Know Your Rights, they get screenings, they get referrals to pro bono counsel, or possibly in-house representation. I think where it gets really hard is when the kid gets released. Often the child is not being released to a parent. They might be going to an aunt or grandma or a cousin. And so now that person has to absorb this child out of federal custody, but that's an added cost, obviously. And ensure that child has access to counsel is a very challenging it's a very challenging process. This is the only system where the only system of law where a child has no right to court-appointed counsel, unlike in a criminal case or some other type of proceeding.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, it just makes me wonder how a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old can make an asylum case, on their own.
Yeah.
To me, it's incomprehensible, I guess.
Yeah, and that's exactly what's happening with the separation from parents, right? A 4-year-old can't be expected to know why they fled their country. All that information and those documents are with their parent. But if the parent is in some other detention center and they're not communicating, and the parent can't get that information to the child for their own case, it becomes a very tricky situation.
And you can have perverse outcomes like the one that you detailed, where the parent wins an asylum case, and the 4 or 5-year-old is in a separate case, and doesn't have any sort of access to the parent's case or contact with the parents who has won their asylum case. There's no precedential value, I guess, on that case. And you can have a 4-year-old who loses their asylum case, and you have the parent who wins their asylum case, and they're in 2 separate places, and they're never going to see each other again.
Yeah. Or vice versa. I mean, I'm hopeful that for this family, this child will get asylum because her mom did. But yeah, that is a very real possibility, and that possibility increases the more that policies like the recent ones by the administration are enacted.
Thank you. The chair would like to recognize both Claudia Loli and Yuridia Loera from United We Dream. Welcome.
Good morning, buenos dias. My name is Claudia Loli. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a DACA recipient. I was born in Venezuela, but moved at a young age with my single mother to El Paso, the safest community in the country. I currently reside in Austin, where I function now as a director of student outreach and organizing for Deans Not Boards. And I'm a proud member of United We Dream, the largest immigrant youth-led organization in the country. Thank you to members of this caucus for listening to my testimony. Every day we hear stories of people who are detained indefinitely, of children torn from the arms of their mothers, of young women like Claudia Gonzalez being murdered, of sexual violence in detention centers, of negligence and abuse of children, all at the hands of Trump and the squads of border police and ICE agents that have taken up a banner to purge our country of people who look and talk like me. This war against black and brown immigrants targets those who do not speak English, who look different, and has no regard for legal status. This country I came to as a child with my mother has now become the country where I am vulnerable to an authoritarian, post-constitutional system that in one moment took me from a regular work trip to an immigrant's worst nightmare. Since moving to Austin, traveling to border cities has not been uncommon for me. Through the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, I have been able to study, work, drive, support myself and my family, and travel for work because of the protected status that the permit has allowed me. But here's what happened to me on Saturday, May 19th, in the United States of America, in the country that I grew up in the country that is my home. While attempting to return home, I was singled out from a security line at an airport, interrogated, put into police vehicle, and moved to a detention center because of a new directive to CBP agents that requires them to run new background checks and fingerprints on DACA recipients. When I asked which directive, I was simply told the one from DC. When asked if I was being detained, Agent Jones, a tall white male, said yes and gave me no reason why. I sat there as he told me that my DACA status does not protect me and neither does a federal court order because, and I quote, the Border Patrol does not listen to the federal courts. They only listen to the president. He took me from an airport to a prison-like facility. I was stripped from my safety, layer by layer, piece by piece. I went from a common work trip to the back of a deportation car, from the companionship and safety of my coworker to all of my belongings being taken away. I insisted on keeping my work permit card on me as I had heard stories of officials losing these cards while putting immigrants into detention centers. I was being swallowed by a system that did not seem accountable to the freedoms granted by the Constitution, concepts that I took for granted as applying to everyone until now. Do they apply to immigrants? Is there a class of people who live parallel lives, sharing our space but not our rights? This is incomprehensible to me, that anyone who considers themselves American and proclaims to understand the Constitution and the notions of freedom would be so blind as to see that these rights are for everyone or they are for no one. I found myself locked in a room with 30 or more other women. Some were on thin mats covered in foil blankets. The smell was indescribable. Many of these women were from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Some had been there for days. I met a mother who had her children stripped from her arms, and she had not seen or known about them for days. She had only heard that she could be deported and that her children would more than likely remain here, all while she was forced to sign forms that she could not understand nor read. But it's these immigrants that who our current administration labels as criminals, rapists, and animals, who see me for my humanity and respect what little is left of my dignity. I was told by Agent Jones to get comfortable, that I could be there for a few days. I asked to call my attorney and was told that no one there had that right, including me. I panicked, feeling stripped of all recourse. I was interrogated on multiple occasions by different agents, never with my attorney present. They wanted to know when I entered the U.S. They asked questions about my family. All the while, I tried to remember my training, how to respond correctly, and more importantly, how to stay calm. I've been an advocate for others like me, DACA beneficiaries, and immigrant families while in college and in my professional life. I've given numerous workshops on how to respond exactly in these types of situations. But I learned now that preparing for one and living through one are completely different things. I ended up being released after about 4 hours instead of deported. But what will become of the others left behind? Will the mother that I met in that cold holding cell be reunited with her children? And how many more are still trapped inside that system that, as Agent Jones said, answers only to the president? This is not the country I came to as a child with my mother and grew up in. This is not the place where I attended high school, joined the theater, went to the movies, danced at prom. But I find myself embroiled in its systems gone awry. Its irreprehensible immorality and fading humanity. And I will not give up. Our ask is clear to all elected officials at the federal, state, and local level. Abolish ICE, CBP, and all other agencies engaged in this brutal war against immigrants. Do everything in your power to help us regain our strength, to help us take back our country, to welcome my migrant siblings instead of murdering, abusing, and dehumanizing women, men, and children who have come looking for something other than what they have, something that still can and must remain the American dream. Thank you.
Members, any questions? Thank you for your testimony. Representative Gonzalez?
Sorry, Chairman.
Yes.
I just want to say I love you, and your story is very powerful, and I'm glad you're sharing it with us. I'm really sorry that happened to you, and I'm just honored that you shared your story and your vulnerability. It changes people's lives. So thank you.
I won't be sharing.
Okay. All right. The chair calls Sara Ramey from the Migrant Center. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you for holding this panel on such an important topic. My name is Sara Ramey. I'm the Executive Director with the Migrant Center for Human Rights. We're a new nonprofit. We incorporated in the state of Texas in August of last year, specifically to help low-income immigrants who are detained in the San Antonio area. I'm here today to share their stories, to explain how family separation has impacted the mothers and fathers that we work with, and also to give a brief overview of several legal arguments related to the issue of family separation. The first point that I would like to make is that families are often not given notice that they will be forcibly separated. In the situations where they are given notice, it's in the form of a threat that is intended to be a deterrent for them seeking asylum in this country. Chief of Staff John Kelly specifically said that the family separation policy is meant to be a deterrent. As individuals here probably remember, in 2015, the no bond policy that the administration had put in place to serve as a deterrent was struck down by the courts. And we believe this policy is constitutionally impermissible for the same reasons. The other reason that the bond policy was struck down, and that also applies to this case, is that it's fundamentally impermissible to punish an individual, a family, a mother, a child, for the potential future behavior of another individual. So we wanted to bring that to everyone's attention. I'd like to mention the case of an individual. I'm going to call him Roberto here for purposes of confidentiality. He came with his 2 daughters to the Laredo Port of Entry and asked for asylum. He was told that he could not request asylum, that asylum was not offered here in the United States. A Border Patrol officer pulled out his pistol and pointed it at his face in front of his 2 young children when he insisted on seeking asylum in the U.S. And his young daughter, pulled on her father's jacket and said, "Father, I'm afraid something might happen to you, vamos." And so they went back. They subsequently sought asylum at the second bridge, and through a series of coercive tactics, the father stood strong. He was a well-educated man and understood the importance of standing up for his rights. Other families might not have that same level of background in social studies and hermeneutical science. And one of the threats that was used was family separation, that his children were going to be taken from him. And he told me he didn't believe the officers. He thought they were just trying to force them to go back. He didn't think that the United States would ever practice forced family separation as a country. So I met him at the Pearsall Detention Center and spoke with him about his case. I think I'm going to return to his case in a moment, but what I would like to mention right now is that individuals have the right to seek asylum. Prosecuting parents for illegal entry, prosecuting parents for smuggling when they are coming to seek asylum, we believe is not legal. And I'm happy to answer more specific questions about both of those. As the panel may know, in a course of about 13 days in May, 658 children were forcibly separated when their parents were taken for prosecution for illegal entry. And many of those families are probably asylum seekers who are fleeing persecution. As one individual explained to me, because it is a very dangerous journey, right? People aren't making this journey just because. They said, well, we know that it's going to be difficult, but if we face certain death, if I know my child's going to be killed or forcibly recruited, I don't have another option. I have to leave. I have to find protection for my family. And in fact, we've seen the numbers of asylum seekers remain steady. There's been some recent reports this week that they're actually going up. So there's no data showing that there's any deterrent effect. Even if that were effective, we don't think that family separation for multiple other reasons is something that we should be pursuing as a country. The family separation itself is outside of the asylum context, is a violation of domestic and international law. The Supreme Court in Moore versus City of East Cleveland stated that the sanctity of the family is deeply rooted in this nation's history and traditions, and for that reason is constitutionally protected. International law has very strong jurisprudence, both through treaties and through case law, on the rights of parents, rights of children, and family unity, privacy rights in the family context. There is currently a petition for precautionary measures submitted with the Inter-American Court. I believe it was submitted last week by several organizations, including the University of Texas. And they goes further, right? They are arguing that the forced separation, tearing apart the children from their parents, constitutes torture under international law. And as much as I do not want to say that our government is torturing these families, if you look at the legal definition and you look at what's going on, it's pretty hard to argue otherwise. One of the worst things about this whole policy, and just to make sure the record's clear, family separation isn't new. Manoj had alluded to that earlier. Between October and April, so in about a 6 month period recently, ORR had contacted DHS in 700 cases of children who had been separated from their parents. And since we've been working at the detention center on a fairly regular weekly basis, we're coming across parents who've been separated from their children and other family members for one reason or another. But one of the worst parts of this process is that families are not advised as to the location of their relative. Okay, children don't know where their parents are. Parents don't know where their children are. They don't know if they've been deported, if they're being taken care of appropriately, or have any way of contacting them. In the case of Roberto, it took him 8 days before he was able to locate his daughters. The only reason why he was able to find out where they were is because of a family member. They called the family member, and then when he called the family member advised him. It wasn't because ICE or anyone in the government helped. Now, to give the government a little bit of credit, he did insist with them that they arrange a call, and they did arrange a call, and he was able to talk to his daughters, and he felt much safer and better after that. But what he said when he was separated from his children and not given an opportunity to say goodbye, They were taken to another room, and he only was able to say goodbye to one of his daughters because she was on her way to use the restroom when they were pulling him into another room. He said, "Me partió mi alma, me partió mi corazón." My soul and my heart split open when that happened. And I think that he's speaking for a lot of families when he says that. He spoke to me about several other families whose children were taken, including one lady who was subsequently deported. And I have no idea what happened to her children. I found out about the case after she had already been removed. And I can only hope that the children are okay and that they can reunify at some point. One of the big issues, we have a couple board members who work in the Valley and see a lot of this firsthand, and I asked them what they wanted to raise here, and they gave me a very long list, which we don't have time to go into. But one of the big issues is accountability in our government, and I think from the story that we've seen, and I'm sure Manoj can testify to this as well with the cases they've seen at Raíces, the government is not accountable, and that is a fundamental issue to our democratic system. We need checks and balances. We need appropriate oversight. And to the extent that members of this caucus and of the legislature more broadly can make sure that whenever there is an ICE contract or a GEO or core civic contract or an ORR contract, that there is an independent and thorough process for evaluating and checking in and holding some sort of accountability standard. That's really, really important. And we see that with the detention conditions at the border. Customs and Border Patrol has a mechanism for filing complaint for abuses, and then those often are not really followed up on. There's either no answer provided or no reprimand. And so there are organizations that are working on that issue. We won't go into that, but accountability is really something that needs to be improved. And it's also worth mentioning that there's no opportunity to challenge forced separation. So I'm an immigration lawyer, and for all of us who are involved in the law in one form or another, you need an opportunity to challenge government action. And there's no mechanism or forum to do that at present that I'm aware of. So that's a problem as well. The last issue that I wanted to bring to folks' attention today was alluded to by Manoj, and that's the due process rights of individuals. It's a huge threat to separate families because the parent can't help the child prepare for their case, because the parent is a witness. Sometimes when the child's young, they're the key witness in that case. And so because of these due process violations and because of the humanitarian concerns, our office will put in request with the asylum office to issue notice to appear, the charging document that will allow individuals to not have to wait for a credible fear screening and hopefully get through that interview quickly so that they can have a right to present their case to immigration court. Luckily, we've had success so far and have not seen a lot of parents being deported without their children. But that's totally up to the discretion of the asylum office. And I can't hold out hope that I think it's a case-by-case thing. I don't think there's a positive policy in that regard. And so Roberto was able to get his notice to appear, get bond, and as of last week, he was reunited with his daughters, so we're very happy about that. We do also help with bond and parole requests. And, he was basically, because children are often, and families are often detained for a shorter period of time, depending on the circumstances. He was in detention for about 2 months longer than his daughters. And so just want to let folks know that the detention, even once the children have been able to reunify with the sponsor, might be continuing for a time. And I'm just going to leave you all with a quote from the Supreme Court in Smith versus Organization of Foster Families. It said, "If the state were to attempt to force the breakup of a natural family over the objections of the parents and their children, I should have little doubt that the state would have intruded impermissibly on the private realm of family life, which the state cannot enter." We ask that our state not become complicit in the forced separation of families, and that legislatures do anything and everything in their power to support family unity. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. We've been joined by Representative Arevalo from San Antonio. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Members, any questions? Representative Hinojosa?
So I appreciate the suggestion that we look at any contracts we have with any of these federal agencies to provide for transparency and oversight. But I want to ask, especially lawyers, but if anybody has any ideas, we do have oversight over DPS as well as other state agencies. So appreciated that suggestion, but if there are any other ideas that you have in terms of our oversight of some of these state agencies that interact, appreciate you letting us know, and for future panelists that come before us, that would be helpful.
Right. And I'm going to refer the question over to Manoj as well to get his take on this. I think one of the things we need to keep in mind when we're talking about oversight, especially the children's facilities, we need that, but we really need to not be detaining children. So there was a big debate a year or two ago about child care licensing family detention centers. I think that most of us would agree and that is in part potentially helpful, right? We need that accountability. But really what we need to be doing is not detaining children and not detaining families. And the idea that these facilities were child care centers, I mean, if you look at what a child care center is and you look at these facilities, there's no argument. So I think what we really need to be looking at is alternatives to detention. And there are multiple alternatives. The case management system that the government was running in certain communities was terminated by the Trump administration, I believe, last summer. There are orders of supervision. There are ankle monitors where there's an issue about flight risk, which usually isn't an issue, but there are alternatives to keeping children locked up. So I think that's an important piece of the conversation to keep in mind. We don't. There's a tendency, I think, with these conversations to say, okay, we'll detain them together, right? Don't separate the families. Or as Manoj talked about, saying children aren't appearing for their court hearings, or children have fallen off the radar, therefore we need to detain them longer. And so I just want to make sure that we're all sort of conscientious of the detention context itself being really traumatic and harmful for the children, making sure that we can find reasonable alternatives.
Yes, Manoj?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what some of Sarah was saying. I think turning back to the state involvement in contracts with ICE, between ICE and GEO or CoreCivic or whatever private prison operator is a fantastic idea. My understanding is a lot of the contracts are entered into with a county or with a municipality rather than with the state. And so I'm not entirely sure, and it's my ignorance to the inner workings of government in Texas. I'm not a native Texan, so I apologize. But I wonder if there maybe a step is improved communication or involvement by the state in those types of contracts that the county or the municipality is entering into with the private prison operator and with ICE to ensure that there is increased visibility and transparency in what's happening.
One of the issues that we've been dealing with is, oftentimes these federal systems are black boxes. You have no visibility into the federal system, into timelines, into time frames. We had a U.S. Senator try to go to a detention facility yesterday, was not permitted to enter. Oftentimes these are private facilities where there's a sort of layer of accountability removed from policymakers. And we are elected by the public to provide those checks and balances that you referred to. So the reason we're having this hearing, because oftentimes if we want to make a visit, you better believe it's going to be sanitized for public consumption, right? Like I've been down to Willacy County to visit that center, and I'm sure that prior to my arrival they had it Disneyland ready, and the people who were detained there were told not to talk to us. when we came through. So it is very difficult oftentimes for us to exert oversight in an effective way without receiving testimony from people like you who have been through the system, like Loli. So we're grateful that you provided this. Our Vice Chair, Representative Gonzalez, this is not the end of our process. Our Vice Chair is going to be convening a working group where we're going to continue to take this information, synthesize it in a report to the legislature, so that if there are recommendations related to state oversight over some of these contracts, maybe provisions that we need to enter into these contracts regarding surprise visits rather than nicely curated oversight visits. Those are the things that we're going to be pursuing during the next legislative session. So we're grateful for the testimony. I know that Representative Hinojosa had a question.
To have follow-up, you said that an alternative could be these ankle bracelets, and so makes sense to me. It probably would save millions of dollars, I would think, to have families being monitored in that way as opposed to being detained. And so two things I'm wondering. One is, what's the pushback on that, and has anybody looked at the cost savings of that?
So I don't have the data in front of me. I believe that the per person cost for family detention, and actually Manoj might have more updated numbers, is about $230 a day, whereas alternative to detention can be about $7 a day. There's huge cost savings regardless, and that are well documented. Ankle monitors are incredibly problematic for a number of reasons. Number one, they're heavy. They have to be charged regularly. An individual has to sleep with them, shower with them. They often don't feel like they can walk in public wearing shorts or skirt, right? In the hot Texas weather, wearing pants all the time is challenging because people stigmatize them as criminals. And it's my belief that it is another form of detention because the government is regularly monitoring you. The foundation, going back again to the Constitution, the foundation of who we are as a country is we stand for liberty, right? We stand for only being deprived of that liberty where absolutely necessary. And in the immigration context, under both domestic and international law, that would include an individualized determination that that particular person is a flight risk and needs to be regularly monitored. I think it's more humane and in many cases just as effective to have, say, a regular 3-month check-in with the family. One of the important points that Manoj brought up that I would like to emphasize, there is data out there showing that when folks have legal representation or a case manager accompanying them through the immigration court process, their attendance rates are much, much higher. And so there are ways that we can support people by providing counsel, by providing social services to help them understand what is the process and help them get to their hearings, right? They might not have transportation. They certainly won't have a driver's license here in Texas. So there's logistical things that can be done, and having access to counsel is really a huge help.
So let me just make sure I'm clear. You know, you're preaching to the choir, obviously, but we also live in the reality of politics in this state, in this country, and so I'm just trying to figure out, how do we get better? This is obviously unacceptable where we are now. You had mentioned these ankle monitors. Seems to me to be a lot better than incarceration. Obviously, case management and a more humane approach would be ideal. Is it? Did I misunderstand that you don't see it's better than incarceration?
I definitely do think it is better.
Okay.
I just want to make clear, not only for folks here who are informed of the issue, but for viewers that might be watching on the Facebook live stream, that we are not recommending that as the best alternative. I will say that I have spoken with many individuals at the detention center who said, I just need to get out. I mean, even if I have to wear an ankle monitor, I really need to get out. I need to see my child. I need to be able to go to the doctor. We've had a lot of issues with medical care in the detention center. It's incredibly stressful, the anxiety that folks go through, the challenges in getting legal information to prepare their cases. So I think ultimately, as someone coming from direct service work, I think that that decision needs to be with the client. It's not a decision that we should necessarily be making, but I think that us as a government or as a people need to offer options for people and have those options be reasonable and in response to their particular circumstances.
Members, any further questions? Yes, Representative Wale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Some of the talk has been, and what I'm hearing is part of this zero tolerance policy is the deterrent, right? Is what we've heard from the Chief of Staff, Kelly. Reports that I've also been kind of reading are that it hasn't been a deterrent because they're actually still coming. Families are still coming, and they're going through this inhumane process. Do you happen to have an idea of how long these families are actually separated? So once your child is ripped from your arms, how long that child is in a detention facility? Do y'all have any experience with that? I mean, just anecdotally in your own cases, and also how long the parents are in detention, right? Because you mentioned, one of the, I guess the example, there were 2 months, outside of, or they were in detention, I guess, 2 months.
I think that's pretty
than
common. So the way that the asylum process works is an individual claims fear when they first interact with usually Customs and Border Patrol, and then they're scheduled.
So let me stop you there, right? Because the issue of unlawful entry versus unlawful presence and insert without inspection are two different issues. But in this case, you are turning yourself in, right? So there's this, it's in all this, crazy response, I guess you want to call it, is in. There's just streams of people crossing the border. Right? I guess that's the narrative that some folks want to continue to push. But these folks are actually turning themselves in, right? So they and their children are crossing the border and saying, "Hey, I'm here. Give me my credible fear."
So I think it's both. Roberto, I asked him, I said, "Why didn't you cross the river?" And he said, "Because I didn't want to put my children at risk." He didn't use a smuggler at all. He said, "I wanted to do the right thing and follow the law." And then, of course, we know what type of greeting he got. I think people who do use smugglers, because that's how they know to come, the smugglers will often have them cross the river. And so, they don't have the knowledge, they don't know, or they're not in the process to be able to go to the bridge. Sometimes what will happen is we see families, when they do come in contact with CBP, let's say they're coming by in a vehicle, they'll wave, they'll say, "Hey, I'm here, I need help." And they will sort of affirmatively identify at that point. And if they're claiming protection after crossing without documents, or whether they're presenting to the bridge, or if it's someone who's been in the community for 15 years, right, and they're picked up. If they claim fear at any point to a government officer, they should be scheduled to speak with an asylum officer who has specialized training in asylum. That's why it's so a problem for CBP officers to say, "Oh, there's no asylum," or "I don't think you're eligible," or everyone from your country's lying, "I'm not going to believe you." When they haven't even talked to the individual or have any training in our asylum laws, which frankly can be very complicated. When they get to the interview, okay, in the family detention context, that tends to be within a week, and Manoj has more experience with that. And currently, I've worked in family detention in the past, but I'm not doing that work right now. And also, he can probably speak to the wait times in ORR. But for the adults, they're going to be about a month waiting for that initial interview. That can fluctuate based on caseload at the asylum office, but it is usually about a month in my experience. And then they might get a decision relatively quickly. I would say within a week. And then they're looking at another week probably for ICE to review whether or not they can be released. And then it's going to they have to get their sponsor documents, and then they have to have someone actually go and pay. So I think for someone to be in detention about 2 months from the time of apprehension or presenting themselves at the bridge is fairly common. In thinking about today, I decided I'm going to start asking folks that question and trying to gather some data on that, because I don't know if there is any data publicly available on that, and just having better sense, I think, would be helpful, the actual wait time.
Yeah, I mean, that would be helpful. Just, I mean, again, I mean, you're having your children ripped from your arms, and I got a 7 and a 4-year-old too. I couldn't imagine ever going through that type of experience. You know, I don't know if you have any other insight into the longevity of the stay, how long you're separated from your child. Because I mean, you also have children that don't. I'm assuming you don't have children that don't have a sponsor, don't go through OR, and they're stuck in a facility. And I just don't know how long they'd be staying there too.
Right. Yeah. Well, so ORR is supposed to look for any appropriate family member that they can release the child to. A lot of times, the kid and the parent are separated, and then the child is released to some other family member, maybe grandma or an aunt or a cousin or whoever, who they probably don't know as well as their parent, but that's where they are. If the parent is the only sponsor, the only possible sponsor, then the child is likely to be detained in ORR custody until the parent gets out, which was the case of the family I mentioned, where the mom was the only possible sponsor for that child. And so after the mom got released from detention, then only could the child get released. So it can really vary. Well, in terms of detention time, it can really vary, but the family separation from parent to child, I would say for sure is at least 2 months. I would think typically longer, to be perfectly honest. I think another thing to keep in mind is we have been working with a lot of parents who just say, I want my kid. If that means I have to go home and give up my asylum case, then so be it. I just want my kid. Understandable, but what the parent doesn't understand necessarily is that the child has their own legal case with their own judge. So it's not as simple as the parent saying, I'm going to go on the next plane back to my country and I want my kid with me. Because that kid has to go in front of a judge, and the judge has to order that the child be returned. The judge has to grant voluntary departure or order removal. So parents may be getting deported, giving up their right to asylum, not realizing that their kid is not going to be on the same plane with them. And it may be several more weeks or months or whatever until the kid is actually deported with them too.
If I can just add something to that. There's a case of a lady that I'm working with right now. I don't remember if she came in January or February, but she came in the beginning of the year. She was separated from her 3-year-old son, who was taken to ORR. We requested her release with ICE. She was an arriving alien. She presented at the bridge. There's no judicial review. She's completely reliant on ICE's discretion. ICE refused to release her. They gave her a template letter saying, we've reviewed her file, we refuse to release you. I contacted her deportation officer and I said, I want an explanation. I need to be able to explain this to my client. She deserves an explanation. And they said that one of the reasons they were refusing to release her is because she didn't have adoption papers. She had informally adopted her son a couple hours after he was born because the mother wanted to give the child up. And here's the kicker. ORR released her 3-year-old to her daughter here in Austin. Okay. So ORR did an extensive evaluation of the family's background, determined that her daughter is a safe sponsor, right? That there's no issues with child trafficking, right, or smuggling, and at the same time, on the other hand, we have an ICE officer over here, even though we've presented photos of the family together from the time that he was born, right, and other documents from the hospital explaining that he's been getting regular checkups and that they've been attending him and that she's the mother. They're refusing to release her. And so she is actually going to be detained until the middle of July, until she has her asylum hearing, and hopefully she'll win the asylum hearing and be able to get out. But she hasn't been able to see her son since that time, and I know that her daughter's spoken to me and that he's having a really hard time being away from her for such an extended period. So there's all sorts of situations that come up, and the detention time the separation time can be very difficult.
Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for providing your testimony today. We look forward to working with you over the upcoming months to compile a report to the legislature. Thank you. Chair now would like to call up our second panel, and I may not get all these names right, but Cheesty Anderson, Children's Defense Fund, Will Francis, National Association of Social Workers, Caitlin Caldwell, National Association of Social Workers, and Joel Schweitzer, AGC Global Jewish Advocacy.
Am I turning in copies of this?
Sure. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for coming in. I know some of you are from out of town, so we're grateful. Some of you had family obligations to attend to and had to audible on the fly, so we're grateful that you would all be here to present your testimony today. Why don't we start off with, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Cheesty Anderson? Cheesty, I apologize.
Oh, don't worry, everybody gets it wrong.
Sorry. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having this hearing today. My name is Cheesty Anderson. I'm the Senior Policy Analyst at the Texas Office of the Children's Defense Fund. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today about our grave concern with the new federal policy to separate children from their families when entering the U.S. In May, Customs and Border Protection reported at a Senate hearing that 658 children had been separated from their families in the first 13 days of implementation. This kind of separation is causing physical, developmental, and psychological harm to children. With each passing day, we allow this situation to persist. We must take immediate action to stop this practice, reunite these children with their parents, and end the harm-inflicting and shameful use of family incarceration in our country. The process for separating families has become clearer over the last few days and entails migrant parents being charged with a crime and placed in adult immigration detention centers while their child or children are transferred to the custody of the Department of Health and Human Services. These children, some still toddlers, find themselves in facilities alone and far away from where their parent is detained. It is difficult to find words to express the outrage associated with the idea that our government is inflicting terror on children as a matter of U.S. policy. This outrage at the infliction of harm is not only mirrored in the outpouring of support from people across this country who decry this action as a fundamental human rights violation, it is also supported by research. It is well documented that forced separation of children from their parents represents a traumatic and toxic event that can cause irreparable harm to a child's developing and vulnerable brain. It disrupts the parent-child relationship and causes an increased risk of both physical and mental illness. Adverse childhood experiences, including the incarceration of a family member, are well-recognized precursors of negative health outcomes later in life. The psychological distress, anxiety, and depression associated with separation from a parent follow the children well after the immediate period of separation, even after eventual reunification with a parent or other family. In addition to the damaging effect of a forcible separation, detention itself is in general harmful to children. In the 2017 legislative session, CDF testified against the licensing of detention centers as child care centers because of the documented negative impact on a child's physical and mental health and development. Direct reports from physicians, psychologists, and social workers who assess children at the Texas-based Dilley and Carnes detention centers found children throughout the centers to have broad general anxiety along with signs of major depressive disorder, PTSD, and suicidal ideations. Younger children were regressing to earlier developmental stages, losing their ability, for example, to walk, to talk, or to be potty trained. Institutionalized rearing, growing up in detention centers even for short periods of time, is one of the most adverse environments that scientists have studied for children. Under the conditions of prolonged and intense stress, the body's natural stress responses and the release of specific hormones that aid in the fight and flight response are overused. The condition of chronic deprivation and threat affects neural and brain development, which in turn determines cognitive and behavioral functioning in children well into adulthood. It is important to note that at present we do not entirely know the conditions children are experiencing in HHS care. On Sunday, June 3rd, Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon attempted to gain access to child detention facilities in McAllen and Brownsville to document the conditions children are experiencing. In McAllen, he was allowed to visit with asylum seekers, but when he attempted to visit the shelter housing children in Brownsville, he was denied access, referred to an HHS office in Washington, D.C., and ultimately was removed by police. It is troubling that members of Congress who are concerned about the welfare of children in detention are unable to get information about the condition of these children or even get a phone call answered by HHS. We cannot express severely enough the harm our government is inflicting on children by separating them from their parents and then incarcerating them in detention centers. These actions are reprehensible and beneath us as a country. We urge every member of the Texas legislature to take immediate action to advocate to Congress and the federal government on behalf of these children, and in the meantime to use their authority to witness and to document what is happening in detention centers in our state. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you for your testimony. Members, any questions?
Thank you. My name is Will Francis, and I'm the Government Relations Director for the National Association of Social Workers Texas Chapter, and I sincerely appreciate the opportunity to testify today. I would just like to thank Malk for taking the time to hold this hearing and to convene these panels and to have people come speak, and then especially to develop a report that will have recommendations that will go to the full legislature that everyone can hopefully take action upon. A zero-tolerance immigration policy that would prosecute families who attempt to cross the border and forcibly separate children from parents is malicious and counter to best practices related to child well-being. On May 7th, Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced this policy for families immigrating into the United States and characterized the parents who and used unacceptable language designed to demonize undocumented immigrants. For example, he characterized the parents seeking to escape extreme poverty and violence as smugglers. This paints the incorrect picture that parents are criminals, not asylum seekers fleeing terrible conditions that include death threats against their families. Currently, HHSC oversees the monitoring of the family detention centers through Rule 748.7 of the TAC. This allows residential child care licensing to enforce compliance and conduct inspections, although some requirements that other GROs must adhere to are waived. Legislation mandating these changes did not pass last session, so these stipulations remain in place through regulatory process and not through statute. I'm not aware of RCCL having oversight to the child-only detention centers, like the one that former Walmart that Senator Merkley was denied access to. In practice, if these were monitored as child care facilities, DFPS could investigate abuse and neglect claims there. But NASW Texas does not recommend providing RCCL oversight, as these children would be much healthier if they were supported through community placements. It does leave them in a gray area, though, and it does highlight the need for children to be placed in the least restrictive placements, as all children in the child welfare system are required to be placed. It is telling that officials from the Department of Health and Human Services visited 4 military bases in Texas and Arkansas to determine whether they could be used as facilities to house immigrant children. This indicates that the Trump administration has a large-scale plan to increase the prosecutions of adult undocumented immigrants and deliberately separate children from parents. Our concern is that these children could end up in the foster care system either directly or indirectly. A plan to temporarily house children on military bases is alarming. However, it is even more concerning when we realize that the Department of Health and Human Services and Office of Refugee Resettlement lacks the resources and capacity to safely oversee the influx of children that has resulted in this ill-advised family separation policy. HHSC and OOR have been criticized in the past for placing children at risk. A 2016 independent investigation found that more than 24 unaccompanied children had been sent to homes where they were sexually assaulted, starved, or forced to work for little or no pay, and I believe you brought that up, Representative Gonzalez. The investigation revealed that HHS did not complete thorough background checks of many adult sponsors, all of which led the Chicago Tribune to describe ORR as, quote, the worst foster parent in the world. In January of 2016, ICE launched the Family Case Management Program, the FCMP, as an alternative to detention initiative that used qualified case managers to promote participating compliance with immigration obligations. FCMP was intended to provide services both at the beginning and at the end of the immigration life cycle and provide appropriate services to participating low flight risk families. Unfortunately, in June of 2017, with over 600 families participating, ICE closed the program down. It largely focused on special populations such as pregnant women, nursing mothers, and families with young children. Intensive supervision through such items as ankle monitoring, which Representative Hinojosa brought up, does cost less at about $7 per day versus $36 per day for case management, but both are much less than detention And the real appeal of the current administration lies in the deportation rate, which is substantially higher. Over the same time period, the case management deported 15 of its participant families, while intensive supervision programs deported around 2,200 individuals. The Trump administration allotted $57 million of the 2018 budget for intensive supervision programs, which can be used much more exclusively for parents whose children have been removed. NASW is working on the national level with Senator Karen Gillibrand from New York, who is in the process of introducing legislation that would reestablish the FCMP and use social workers to conduct assessments. The purpose of the legislation is to ensure that families with children are assessed by a qualified social worker immediately after apprehension and are released together unless exceptional circumstances indicate immediate risk to a child. If the assessment determines that a person needs additional services in order to comply with the applicable immigration laws pertaining to their presence in the United States, those family members are connected to programs and resources through referral, where the social worker documents why no referral is necessary. NASW plans to continue to work at the state and national level on immigration issues and will collaborate with our partners directly involved in the issue with any offices seeking to connect with a variety of social workers involved in the community level who are interested in policies that would increase the support system for anyone newly arrived in our country. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you for your testimony. Welcome.
Good morning. My name is Caitlin Caldwell, and I'm an intern at the National Association of Social Workers Texas chapter. I'd like to thank the caucus for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I would like to begin by telling you the story of Maria, then a 15-year-old survivor of human trafficking and sexual assault who entered DFPS's care in the Dallas area. Maria was moved to a foster home in Harlingen, Texas. DFPS investigators and local law enforcement needed Maria's assistance to show them where the crimes against her were committed. Unfortunately, Maria was not able to comply and offer her help due to her immigration status. Maria was not able to pass the necessary border checkpoint without being detained by ICE. Without her help, the investigation could not proceed and was eventually abandoned. Maria will be turning 18 this year and will be eligible for aftercare benefits and placements, but her options will be limited because her petition for immigration relief is still pending and will likely take years to be approved. Similarly, Luis, an 18-year-old survivor of labor trafficking, came into care in Central Texas. Luis was placed with family in El Paso, Texas. When the placement did not work out, he was restricted to supervised independent living placements in the El Paso region, of which there are none. Luis was eligible to live in an SIL program in Austin, but crossing the border checkpoint meant a risk of deportation, even though he had a pending immigration application. Luis's options were severely restricted when DFPS moved him from Central Texas to El Paso. According to DFPS, there are hundreds of kids in care who do not have legal immigration status. Accessing services and support may be difficult or impossible for these children due to their immigration status and their geographical location. If family reunification is no longer an option for these children, they become eligible for special immigrant juvenile status, which offers a path to citizenship. DFPS currently has 3 immigration specialists to oversee the unique needs of hundreds of undocumented children in care, which puts a majority load of the immigration paperwork onto the already overworked caseworkers. Immigration law and the necessary paperwork is complicated and extremely important for the future of these children. There are serious, irreversible consequences that face the child if the immigration paperwork is filled out incorrectly by the caseworker. Obtaining SIJS status and eventually permanent status is a multi-year process contingent on many moving parts, which means some youth age out of care before getting their legal status, making accessing qualified extended services more difficult. I'd like to offer a few recommendations regarding this matter. First, expanding the training provided to CPS caseworkers to include a better understanding of issues and processes for undocumented youth in care. Second, increase the number of immigration specialists. The children in state's care must have a specialist handling their immigration paperwork. Also, develop better training for seeking necessary documentation needed for immigration paperwork from countries other than Mexico. Lastly, expand Section 521-1811 of the Transportation Code to include fee waivers for all Texas issued IDs for children in the state's care, not just for driver's license.
Can you elaborate on that issue? I want to make sure I understand it.
Right. So right now, if you're in the state's care, you can get a driver's license for free. But if you want just a state issued ID, you have to pay the fees for that.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I'd like to thank Representative Mary Gonzalez, who has taken the lead on this issue and has met with DFPS officials to gain a better understanding of undocumented children in the state's care. We hope to accomplish much of the recommended changes through the regulatory process. NASW is currently in the process of identifying gaps in the current DFPS resource guide. While it is beneficial, there is essential information regarding healthcare, aging out of care, and navigating these systems not included in the guide that would be a valuable resource not only for youth, but also for caseworkers, CASAs, attorney ad litem's, and many more. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your testimony. Members, any questions?
I'm going to have questions, but for the whole panel.
Very good. Joel, welcome.
Thank you. Chairman Anchia, members of the caucus, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this morning on these critical issues. For over 110 years, my organization, AJC, has played a pivotal role in advocacy and human relations. As the preeminent Jewish organization engaged in Jewish-Latino relations, we have been at the forefront of coalition building around our shared interests and common concerns for well over a decade. It's an honor that this morning I've been joined in Austin by a number of members of our Jewish-Latino Alliance, a coalition that unites our leaders from both communities to address shared concerns from education to combating anti-Semitism and racism, and of course to immigration. AJC backs immigration reform that would secure the nation's borders while offering a humane alternative to the limbo in which 11 million undocumented immigrants find themselves today. We support viable and efficient pathways to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, and we call for reforms to address future flows and current backlogs in our immigration system. And in particular, we deplore the current administration's cancellation of DACA, a program that was designed to protect from deportation young undocumented immigrants brought to this country as children. AJC rejects the co-option of state and local authorities to enforce immigration policy, since it may lead to racial profiling or other discriminatory practices. We assert the exclusive power of the federal government to enforce immigration law and to secure our borders. We urge increased support for the civic and economic integration of all immigrants, and I'd like to applaud my city, the city of Dallas, for opening its Office of Welcoming Communities and Immigrant Affairs, of which I'm proud to serve on the task force and co-chair its Leadership and Communications Subcommittee. Other local governments would be well served to create similar offices where they don't currently exist. The passage of SB 4 in the last session makes this work especially important. There is much work that needs to be done in building trust between our immigrant communities and the local government. The impact of SB 4 has been to erode that trust in local institutions. Our state would be well served to eliminate it in the next session, and in doing so, reaffirm that exclusive jurisdiction over these matters by the federal government. Immigration enforcement is not and should not be under the purview of state and local authorities. The administration's policy of separating undocumented children from their parents is cruel. Anyone who's listened to the testimony this morning knows that. It doesn't need any further explanation. Absolutely cruel. A society that upholds family values and recognizes the contributions that immigrants have made and continue to make to American life must find a better way to secure the border. Recently, AJC and other Jewish organizations signed on to a letter to Attorney General Sessions and Secretary of Homeland Security Nielsen on this issue. I have copies with me for your review and ask that it be added to the record as well. Signatories are still being confirmed prior to it being sent out at the end of the week, and they're listed on the back. Much has been made in the news lately of the nearly 1,500 missing children who, after being separated from their parents, were placed with sponsors. Attempts to politicize what may amount to non-responsiveness by sponsor families to contact attempts from authorities take focus away from the fundamental issue, which of course why we're here, the cruel separation of children from their parents. At the end of the day, that's what needs to be addressed. And by the way, similar fears will come into play if the proposed questions about immigration status make it onto the next census, as is currently the plan. This is not just bad for the families who choose not to respond, it is bad for Texas, because we run the risk of not receiving adequate services or accurate representation in Congress. Give me you're tired, you're poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. These words, which I suspect many of us could utter by heart, were written 135 years ago by Jewish poet and refugee advocate Emma Lazarus. They reflect our nation's deep-seated values, values that have inspired generations of immigrants to seek out a better life by coming to America to participate in what Ronald Reagan, by way of Pilgrim John Winthrop, called that shining city on the hill. In his farewell address, Reagan stated, "I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know that I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, proud city, built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds, living in harmony and peace, a city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. And if there had to be city walls, those walls had doors. Those doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here. That's how I saw it and see it still." Now more than ever, we need our lawmakers at every level to listen to their constituents and ensure that our great nation remains the compassionate, welcoming beacon of freedom that has inspired so many. We can have security and safety. It need not require us to abandon what must remain America's defining characteristics.
Thank you, Joel. Vice Chair Gonzalez.
Thank you to the whole panel. I really appreciate all your work. Kind of building on from the previous panel, and I think language is very powerful, and I don't think that the word torture has been connected to the realities of how we're treating these children. And I think if a few more people thought of it with that lens, then I think maybe more people would be outraged, right? Because I don't think anyone, regardless of your political ideology, is okay with child torture, right? Like, just, I think connecting those dots. So I kind of want to ask the panel some questions that I've kind of written down here and go through the process. Last session, or last interim, the speaker appointed me to the CPS working group. And in the CPS working group, some of the outcomes that were discussed, or some of the realities that were discussed, is how you had described when a child is removed from a parent, that automatically triggers a traumatic experience, and there are consequences to that. Why are we having such a huge disconnect between understanding a CPS case when it comes to removing children, but not making the same type of connection when it comes to immigrant children? And have you had conversations in regard to that? What are you hearing? I'm just so surprised that when I was sitting in that working group, people were outraged about the trauma that our state was creating when it came to CPS and child removal. But we're having such a huge disconnect, understanding the same type of realities, even worse, right? Because when CPS takes a kid, at least they go into a home, right? Like, this is not happening for these kids. So can you help us unpack that, maybe? No pressure anymore.
No pressure. I don't have a solid gold answer, probably. I think that there's a large part of the population that just doesn't know this is happening. I mean, this is clearly child abuse. To separate a parent from their child against the wishes of that parent, against the wishes of that child, I mean, that's child abuse. I think that events such as this hearing that we're doing right now is a great way to raise consciousness and awareness around the state of what's happening, but I think that most people do not know. And until recently, this has been something that we've struggled to raise awareness about family detention, and only recently has it started gaining a lot of traction in the media where people are hearing about it. I don't know if anybody has anything to add to that, but that's my first answer.
I would just say Representative Rick Miller brought together a working group to work on the definition of trauma-informed care within our child welfare system, and as part of that, we talked about it in other systems, in the education system, in the healthcare system. And you're 100% right, Representative Gonzalez. Nobody really talked about it in the immigration system and was what's happening at the border. And there were people in that room who said the very act of removing a child from their parents is a traumatic experience. We don't know what that does to a child. Some children have different resiliencies or different responses, but it's a traumatic experience in and of itself, meaning 100% of these children receive trauma. And if that's the case, then we need to have everyone be trauma informed and ready to respond to that. Well, if we don't have that system in our own, on either state or federal level, to respond in a trauma-informed care way to these families and children when they approach the border, we know one of those things is you don't remove the kids from their parents. We know another thing is you start immediately asking for services. You don't show up with guns. You don't immediately put them into lockdown facilities. You respond in ways that understand they've experienced incredibly traumatic experiences to get there, and you need to be supportive or it's not going to work. So if we don't overlay that work that we're doing in child welfare on top of this area, then essentially we're not serving these families, and we're basically missing a giant opportunity to take the knowledge we have and to put it into play somewhere else.
Yeah, I struggle because is it intentional to have a disconnect between kids in the CPS system and kids in our immigration system, right? And for them to be both traumatic experiences, but it's so blatant now that I was in a hearing where we were talking about trauma-informed care, and there was outrage, and sitting in this hearing, and just it is beyond me. So thank you for that. But I moving forward as the working group meets, I would like to have conversations about how do we help members draw the same understanding, connect the dots. How can you be outraged here, and this is the same exact thing, but maybe, worse, right? So how do we do that? The next question, and I think you kind of answered this, but I still want to continue it, is state recommendations. You provided 3, state IDs, a specific look at aging out of care, expanding training for CPS workers, or 4, and the increasing the number of immigration specialists. But are there any other recommendations you think that the state specifically could be doing in regards to protecting, serving these children?
I'd like to recommend that we do whatever possible to maximize participation in the voting process. On our end, as a human relations and advocacy group, one of the messages I hear consistently from our partners in the Latino community is our community members are fatalistic when it comes to voting. They don't think their vote has an impact. So one issue is the education piece. Is groups like mine and so many others that are really getting people to understand the power of their vote. And then on the other end, it's our elected officials making sure that we're making it easier, not more difficult for people to vote, and that
we laugh because we know that struggle.
and that the districts and I think there's some work being done on the national level to make sure that that the gerrymandering that has impacted so many of the districts in our country is changed to reflect a more accurate representation of the constituencies, and that's got to change.
What I appreciate about the panel is the intersectional approach, right? So recognizing that social work to redistricting to all this, to the immigration question and the census, all this is impacting children. And the last question I have, and I think somebody talked about it, again, an intersectional lens. Is there research or data demonstrating or talking about sexual assault, sexual abuse in regards to women and children, both in this process or in the centers themselves? And I think I don't want that to become invisible. Do you all have any data, research, or information regarding any of that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I was thinking Raices is a great example of that. I know that there is information out there from how many women who, especially women who are fleeing with just their children, are leaving either sexual violence or direct violence. So I think that is definitely something we can provide to the panel if you're interested in that.
Thank you very much.
Representative Hinojosa.
Representative Gonzalez, I think you brought up a good point about why are we seeing these children as different from our own American children, and you also brought up the point about intersectionality, and it occurs to me that we see the dehumanization of other people's children in all sorts of contexts, right? We see the dehumanization of Black boys in the criminal justice system. It's been documented through psychological studies, but we also, I think we're seeing now the dehumanization of other people's children, immigrant children, as being somehow less worthy of protection than our own in this country. And I think we need to recognize the inherent biases that we bring to this debate and this policy issue, and understand that we were all once immigrants, right? Some of us actually have many generations here, except for the indigenous people, but that these are all our children.
Members, any further questions? I do have, yes, Representative Arevalo.
In listening to the testimony so far, I can't help myself but think about the children who cannot speak for themselves, the infants, and how they are treated in these detention centers. As I'm curious to know the experiences, especially hearing from social workers, if there have been cases of children being malnourished or treated poorly or physically abused. I'm very concerned about them, as well as all the other children as well. I can only imagine if clearly there is a bias. Clearly, people don't see these children, or maybe either they're not aware of this issue, or they see these children as less than. And that's what really, I think Representative Gonzalez was trying to get at, is that they see them less than. Maybe because of the color of their skin or their Hispanic surname. But I'm very concerned with the treatment of the children in the detention center, whether they're physically abused, sexually abused, because clearly they're being mentally abused by just being torn away from their families. And they're living in what looks like cages from what the video did show us. I know I will not be here next legislative session, and I know that this caucus is going to do the work it needs, hopefully by going to some of these detention centers. I know that we have no enforcement on immigration, but we are responsible for the people we represent, even if they are not citizens, but they look like us and may share last names like us.
Thank you, Representative. And the last thing I would ask, and this is directed to any of you or all of you, and it doesn't require a response, but Joel especially, I think we need to think about the role of the faith community here. I'm really grateful that the Jewish community is very active in its work in the Latino community, but there is an opportunity for all faith. There are opportunities for all faith traditions to assist in resettlement, to fill an important role here, and to make sure that these children and women are in a place that is supportive of their journey. So I would just ask, as part of our working group, for any members of the faith community that are in the audience or are listening, we are open to hearing about how we can all work together to make sure that we embrace these families and these asylees and put them in the in the most loving environment possible. So thank you. Members, we're going to call up the third panel. Just a reminder. Yeah, and for members of the audience, we do have cards in the back if you want to write down a question that we will do our best to answer up here. Jackie Udesti will be harvesting those and bringing them up. Our third panel of invited testimony is Astrid Dominguez of the ACLU. Welcome, Astrid. And then Fatima Mendez, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, MALDEF. Welcome. And is Fatima here?
She might be late.
Okay.
She's at the school finance.
I follow. Very good. So prior to your testimony, I also want to mention, because some of these issues were raised during our prior panel, that the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund is representing the Mexican American Legislative Caucus, and we are the plaintiffs in a federal lawsuit against the citizenship question being added to the census questionnaire. We're also very active, and we're recently at the U.S. Supreme Court as litigants in the gerrymandering legislation, and we were also very active on photo ID. So we are engaging in our oversight role, but this organization tries to be muscular in litigation and represent the community, not only in its legislative capacity, but also in judicial fora. across the state, across the country. And with that, welcome, Astrid. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, and members of the caucus. My name is Astrid Dominguez. I'm the director of the ACLU Border Rights Center, and I'm here to share with you the current situation that asylum seekers' families are facing when they arrive to the border. At the beginning of the Trump administration, the Department of Homeland Security had been threatening with this type of policy to separate asylum seeker families from their parents from their children as a deterrent to stop them from arriving to the U.S. This started to happen informally during 2017. The administration denied it. Meanwhile, DHS had a pilot project to separate families and prosecute the parents. On February of this year, the ACLU sued the administration for the cruel and inhumane practice on separating parents and children. We filed a class-wide preliminary injunction asking the court to stop the current family separation practice and policy. So we're currently litigating this case. Our lawsuit covers separation both at Border Patrol stations or at a port of entry, and after individuals are returned to ICE after serving their time. It doesn't address the prosecution's part. On April 2018, the Department of Justice announced the Zero Tolerance Program, which basically stated that DHS would refer all people crossing through to the Department of Justice. So every individual apprehended near the border, they would be referred for prosecution, for criminal prosecution, for illegal entry or illegal re-entry. This policy also included people seeking asylum in the U.S. On May 2018, Attorney General Sessions announced that the zero tolerance policy would also apply to asylum seeker families arriving to our border, which meant a de facto family separation policy. Now, what exactly, what's happening at the border? How does this work? Families seeking asylum arrive to our borders, whether it's at a port of entry or between ports, and they surrender to Border Patrol agents or to customs agents at the port of entry. They're separated from their kids. It could be at the point of arrest, or it could be while they're in Border Patrol custody at a Border Patrol station. And that's where the separation happens. After separation, kids are sent to an Office of Refuge and Resettlement shelter, and they are classified as unaccompanied children. So by separating families, this administration has essentially created a mass crisis of unaccompanied children who were not in fact unaccompanied when they arrived to our border. And as the chairman mentioned earlier, Senator Merkley tried to get access to one of the shelters, or our shelters, which he was denied entrance. Now, parents, what happens to the parents? So the parents are criminally prosecuted. They're presented to federal court and they're charged with a misdemeanor, 1325. This is the first time they've crossed, or with an illegal entry charge, which is, this case is a felony, and that's a 1326. Most of these parents are the first time they're arriving with their kids, so they get a 1325 charge, a misdemeanor, and they get time served. After they get time served, they're in custody of ICE, but they're not reunited with their children, so they're in a different facility from where their kids are at. So historically, border crossings have never been considered immigration offenses. I mean, have been considered immigration offenses that were handled by immigration courts and not federal prosecutors or criminal courts. Also, seeking asylum is not a crime; it's not illegal, and the United States could be potentially violating international law by prosecuting asylum seekers. So. Once the parents, they get time served, they're transferred to ICE, but they're not reunited with their children. Some of the fears we have is the fact that some of these parents might not want to continue with their asylum process because they want to be reunited with their kids, even though they might have an actual asylum claim. And while the child is in ORR custody of the Office of Refuge and Resettlement, the kid might not, they're not in touch with their parents. The parents don't know the whereabouts of the kid. But also some of these children, their parents have been deported, so they're left in the U.S. without the parent. And they can't continue their claim either. So we don't know if the parents also are giving any information. We know they are not. And it's making it complicated to tie their asylum cases, which we've heard in previous panels. If you're a 4-year-old, if you're a 18-month-old, you don't know, you can't make your case in front of an immigration judge. So this is what's currently happening at our U.S.-Mexico border. to asylum seekers. But I also want to highlight, what the draconian immigration policies that this administration has, and that some states like ours have passed. The climate it's creating for immigrants, immigrants in our state, immigrants in our country, currently feel persecuted. Our border is not only militarized by the federal government, but also by our Texas government. Not only do we have a surge of DPS agents, but we also have the National Guard. Border residents face constant harassment and separation of families due to high presence of DPS troopers, like in the Rio Grande Valley. DPS was sent to the RGV due to the humanitarian crisis in 2014, where border residents have felt the impact of their presence. They're constantly racially profiled, and there's been an increase in traffic stops and referrals to Border Patrol whenever DPS encounters an undocumented immigrant during a regular traffic stop. The ACLU has issued a series of recommendations in the past about DPS metrics and reporting on border operations. We'd be happy to provide those to the caucus. Texas has also seen an increase in agreements such as 287G programs, which also have a detrimental impact in our community's relationship with law enforcement. Deputizing our law enforcement agents to do ICE's job is not the best use of our resources, their resources, or taxpayers' money. Currently, 24 counties in Texas have these agreements. And lastly, there's SB 4, the law that the ACLU of Texas is currently litigating with other partners, and that has brought fear and distrust of law enforcement among our immigrant communities. We can't allow DPS or our local law enforcement agencies become an arm of Trump's deportation machinery force. The Texas legislature has to make sure that every resident in Texas feels safe, secure, protected, regardless of their skin color or the place of birth. Thank you.
Members, any questions? Vice Chair Gonzalez.
Thank you, Chairman. Sorry for all the questions.
Please.
What I find really interesting and something we haven't talked about, but I'm not a lawyer. I was a professor before this job. Jeff Sessions' change in asylum seekers and how we interact with them, and you talked about how that is potentially breaking international law. So if the United States is breaking international law, what happens? Is there a remedy? Is there a course of remedy? Is there a process? Or can the United States just continue because they break international law only because these directives are coming really from the top down, right? And so what does that mean?
Full disclosure, I'm not an attorney either.
Oh, okay, great.
But what we know, and what the administration...
We especially want to hear from you then.
The administration claims that even though you refer someone for the asylum seeker for prosecution, that person could still continue their asylum claim. Now, back in 2015, the Office of Inspector General of DHS published a report which found out that they were actually referring asylum seekers for prosecution. Now, those were adult asylum seekers. There was not the families back then. And the OIG stated that the way DHS was doing it, Border Patrol was doing it, they were currently in violation of international law. They issued a series of recommendations and measures for them to take, to change. So far, we have yet to see how those recommendations have changed. And now we have this new policy. And their argument is, well, they can still continue their claim after they serve their time. So that for them, and the way they see it, it's not a deterrent, but in reality, it is a deterrent for immigrants who are seeking asylum, and especially for families, because the parents just want, they feel like if they drop their asylum claim, they will get reunited with their kids faster, and that is not happening. One of our clients, a lady from Congo, now she was not prosecuted, but she was separated from her daughter for 4 months, and she arrived at a port of entry. So we know the agency the goal is really to deter people from coming. But I heard one of the questions, like, people are still coming. Well, these are people that are fleeing for their lives. These are people that are seeking refuge in our country. It doesn't matter, what
potentially might happen once they get here if they're fleeing just to stay alive, right?
That's right.
So we talked about this in the last panel, and actually the panel before, and one of the panelists said that people just don't know that there is child torture happening. Does your organization have the same sentiment that this is torture, that that the United States is actually torturing children?
Just 2 weeks ago, the ACLU published a report about abuse of immigrant children at Border Patrol custody. Now, this report is from a Freedom of Information Act request that we sent to DHS, to CBP in this case, Border Patrol, Customs and Border Patrol, and Border Patrol too, asking for all the complaints they had received regarding abuses of children who were in Border Patrol or CBP custody. Now, we got 30,000 pages, so we have a lot of documents of all the claims that these kids have made. This go from 2009 to 2014. And we filed this FOIA back in 2015. It took them up until now to get those documents, and we put that report out last week. And it goes from verbal abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, physical abuse. I mean, the documents are, it's really horrific stories of how Border Patrol has treated children. Now, the oversight mechanism of Border Patrol and DHS did investigate some. Some were like, well, we can't really continue investigating because children weren't in custody, because they are in custody of Border Patrol for up to 72 hours. During the crisis, it was like a little longer, but so the children, they didn't know where their children were at, to follow up on the case. So our main concern right now is if this is a systematic pattern of abuse. So this isn't just like it happened to one child. What are we doing right now to make sure that these children that are being taken away from their parents are not going through the same types of abuses that all those other kids have? And so far, we haven't been able to get a response. And of course, we continue to advocate and we continue to push the administration to make sure there are proper oversight mechanisms in place to make sure these abuses aren't happening.
I guess what I struggle with, and this is pretty public, I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse. And I was able to go to my father and tell him, years later, but still to have parents that I could talk to. These kids are removed from their parents, and if they get abused, who do they talk to? Who do they tell? And I think that's what's really scary. Thank you for your work.
I will further note that the United Nations Human Rights Office has called on the United States to immediately halt the policy of separating migrant children. The statement released, I believe, earlier today from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees points out that there is nothing normal about detaining children. So I just wanted to read that into the record. Representative Hinojosa.
Thank you, Chairman. There's also, last week, the Texas Civil Rights Project filed an emergency request to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to stop family separations and reunite families. I think somebody mentioned it earlier, but in terms of the report that you're working on, they would be a good resource to, or that the committee's working on it would be a good resource to find out more about the potential international law violation. It looks like the Texas Civil Rights Project, the Women's Refugee Commission, UT Law Immigration Clinic, and a law firm by the name of Garcia & Garcia filed the emergency request.
All right. Any further questions? Thank you for your testimony today. And so our representative from the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, I believe, is still at the hearing on public education. So at this point, it might be helpful, Jackie, if you have any questions from the audience. Has anybody filled out a card? Jackie, give the Queen's wave. So in case anybody needs to furnish a question to you. I think we have one over here. Any other questions? And again, we'll do our best. Part of this this exercise was to take information to the extent we can't answer the question. We will try to incorporate it into our findings in the final report to the legislature for the working group and task force that's going to be chaired by Representative Gonzalez. And if we can't answer the question, we may call up some of our experts. Oh my. Let's see. In what ways do you see the faith community participating in this discussion and also helping these children and the parents. So I think, speaking individually, I think there's an opportunity for the faith community to be engaged with placements to the extent that there are loving environments where these refugees, these asylees can be placed, where children and parents can be kept together. I think that is top of mind, an immediate way that it can occur. I think the faith community can also raise awareness and consciousness in their own congregations about what's happening in the United States, and sort of test with the congregations whether or not this is in keeping with the tenets of their faith tradition. I think that's an important exercise. And finally, you've heard about the needs in detention centers, especially with due process concerns and the finding of volunteers, people who will represent and give voice to these oftentimes minor children in proceedings. That's just another opportunity I can think of off the top of my head. Vice Chair Gonzalez?
Oh no, I was letting you finish that.
Oh, okay. No, please.
We have another question, and I might call Will Francis up here again. Sorry, Will. Yeah. Well, we're fine. And I don't know if you know this. The question was, do any other state agencies interact with the process? Specifically, does CPS interact with unaccompanied minors, or is it, or DPS, or is it just the federal agencies' engagement?
It's primarily the federal agencies. That's DPS, obviously, especially with them being down near the border, does have an issue there. Part of the problem is that there is no MOU between either Immigration and Customs Enforcement or the Border Patrol to really work out these issues. And so part of the problem is that we just don't have necessarily guidance from the federal government on what could happen, so that we know, for example, if a child was, say, down in the McAllen area and they needed medical attention that was available only in Houston, say they needed to see a specialist and they wanted to go there. Hypothetically, they could simply drive through the checkpoint and say, look, I'm a CPS worker, I have a child, we need to get into this. But the checkpoint could say, no, I'm sorry, they just don't know what's going to happen there. And if you look in the actual DFPS guide, they really they don't have any specific guidance about driving through checkpoints, but they do recommend that you transport an undocumented child to the minimum amount possible. So basically, they don't have actual real solutions for working with what we know are hundreds of kids. And what our worries are is that with the greater separations of children and families at the border, those are kids who could directly or indirectly end up in foster care, that somehow they could find their way into our state system, even though the federal government has the obligation for them, and we're concerned about what that could do.
Thank you.
We received a comment or a proposal here. It says, propose that Border Patrol agents be educated on the legal procedures and be accountable for violations of those. Now, it's my understanding that there is an internal investigative procedure within the Border Patrol that is really beyond the scope of our jurisdiction as state legislators. However, there has been to this, the response to this humanitarian crisis has been military, in that the president has mobilized the National Guard down to the border, and we do have, and the governor, we do have jurisdiction over the, sorry, was it National Guard or State Guard? National Guard, okay, so that's federal jurisdiction. We have spent over $2 billion on mobilizing DPS to the border, so that we do have jurisdiction on. And then to the extent that there's an intersection between local law enforcement, we're at the state level are always happy to tell local law enforcement what to do. So we do have some jurisdiction there as well. And it'll be incumbent upon us, and could be part of these recommendations, that there be additional training for those. Let's see, a couple of questions here. How can local agencies help children who have been placed locally here in Austin while their case is being resolved? For example, the public library, if one is the public library is often a safe place for people to come. And is there a way for us to locate children and their relatives to offer services if you're a local provider? The chair calls back up our social work resources to maybe take a stab at this question. Okay. So if there are local agencies such as the public library or outreach coordinators at organizations, either NGOs or local government resources, how can they help while a minor's case is being resolved? And then secondarily, is there a way for these local agencies to locate relatives or family members to offer services to those persons?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's a whole lot of nonprofits, especially down near the border, that specifically will support with housing, with temporary placement, especially for women who do not have relatives in this country to support that housing. And so we can definitely get a resource list to you if that would be good, of sort of ways that you can get plugged in. A lot of what they need are things like blankets and food and other sort of resources down there. When it comes to sort of the idea of, sort of libraries and others and how they get plugged in, part of it is, I think there used to be a greater level of communication between Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Border Patrol on sort of sharing resources, and that's changed a lot as things have sort of tamped down more, as they're removing more of the children. There doesn't seem to be, I think you heard it, just absolutely heartbreaking and amazing testimony from the woman who essentially said, we work with the president now, we do not work with others. And I think that has made sort of a ripple effect on how nonprofits get involved. I also know that there are many refugee and immigration nonprofits that have closed down because they have a whole lot less ability to place in the community now. And so you used to see a whole lot more here in Austin. I think I have the exact name, but the Refugee Resettlement Organization actually wasn't able to work anymore with families who were coming in from all across the globes, not just from our borders, our neighbors to the south. So in general, it's become a lot more challenging, and I think that's precisely something that this caucus could look at, is how do we open lines of communication to get resources as necessary, and how can nonprofits get engaged across the spectrum.
Yeah, and just one comment really quickly. I know in some cities, like in the city of Dallas, we have an Office of Welcoming Cities for new arrivals to the United States, be they documented or undocumented. And that also serves as an aggregator for resources. I don't know if Austin has something similar, but Representative Hinojosa, I know you wanted to offer some insight there.
Well, I just wanted to suggest, it used to be, back when I used to practice immigration law, I worked at the at Catholic Charities Office of Immigrant Concerns. They had interaction with the families that were in proceedings in various ways. Also, at the time, Lutheran Social Services also had some of those contracts with the federal government, and so it may be just proposing, it may be helpful to reach out to those organizations and ask, can we provide books, can we, whatever it is that you have access, whatever resources one has access to.
That's fantastic. I would just, Lutheran Social Services is now Upbring, so if you're interested in reaching out to them, they're Upbring.
And I know that in Dallas, for example, Catholic Charities serves as an aggregator of resources, and there are other. I don't know if there's an analog here for Catholic Charities in Austin, but and whether they do that type of asylee or immigration work. But I know there's Vanna Slaughter in Dallas has done a lot of work on refugee resettlement through Catholic Charities, and so that's a thought. Next question, and Manoj, you may be able to not only touch on the current question, but this question that I'm about to ask, and please feel free to weigh in. Are privately owned detention centers considered federal property? And if not, why wouldn't the state of Texas have jurisdiction?
Well, okay, I'll take the previous question that Will answered. I just wanted to mention that at Raíces, we've hired social workers in all of our offices to work with our clients and impacted communities. And I would strongly encourage, if you're interested, to send people our way, either for legal services or social services. We've also created a program called the LEAF Project, Legal Representation, Education, and Advocacy Fund for Unaccompanied Children, to try to continue providing services for unaccompanied kids, even though the funding is being cut by the government. In terms of the private prisons and being federal property or not, I believe in Texas, the majority of ICE detention centers are run by private prison operators. They're not federal facilities, though I think S3 might have more insight than me. But I will also say that, I know that in the family detention context at the Carnes and the Dilley detention centers, when there have been allegations of child abuse, that DFPS has been involved and has opened investigations into those facilities. So I would think that there is room for Texas agencies to inspect or be involved in those locations.
Astrid?
So a lot of this private prison facilities, it depends a lot on how they do the contract. So, ICE has some facilities and they're totally 100% run by ICE, but there are some others that, ICE contracts with this private facility. There's a little oversight, but sometimes cities or counties are tied to those agreements. And I think that's a very good component. Because it's important that communities are able to provide input in terms of, do we want this private facility here? And most of the time they sell these facilities as, oh, we're going to bring jobs. This is going to be, good for the community. And we've heard communities like McAllen 5 years ago, they said, great, you're trying to create jobs, but these are not the jobs we want. So I think there is that component of, are we making sure that the facility, especially if it's a private facility, they're in for the money, and they're going to try to find people to put in there because it's a business for them. So to have community input, but also an assessment or a study is is this really having a positive impact in our community in every sense? In terms of, is it federal or private property? Federal property. If it's a private facility, even us, most of the time, you hit a wall because they're not required to have the same oversight mechanisms or they're not as transparent as an ICE facility would be, and ICE is not transparent either. But so that gives you kind of a context of, how bad these centers are that are run by private, owners.
Yeah, and certainly there's some very perverse incentives, right, for private operators. They need to keep people incarcerated in beds, and those and empty beds don't provide any revenue, and therefore there's no profit. So, if you're calling balls and strikes, you're going to err on the side of keeping those beds full, and that sort of raises all kinds of civil liberties questions, due process questions, etc. And when you're dealing with vulnerable populations like immigrants and immigrant children, where there are even fewer checks and balances, the opportunity for abuse, I imagine, is even higher, right?
You mentioned, just to add, you mentioned earlier Willacy, and that's an example of, the problem that private facilities bring to certain localities. So Willacy County, the Willacy County was a regional detention facility. It was a criminal alien requirement facility. So these are not immigration facilities. These are, in a way, like second-class facilities. So these are run by they're under BOP. They're under the Bureau of Prison Management, but they contract with a private actor, a private facility. In this case, it was MTC, and they have people that were serving their time for illegal entry or illegal re-entry. All of them were foreign nationals. So these were not, instead of having them in a BOP, they would put them in this different facility. So you're treating people differently. Like, are you a citizen? I put you in BOP. If you're not a citizen, I'm going to put you in this other facility. We did a report a couple of years ago precisely about this CAR facilities. There's 5 in Texas. Willacy was one of them. And the main issues we encounter was, of course, lack of, access to attorneys because it's far away from the major cities, but also the conditions of the facility, medical treatment. They don't have medical treatment. There's one doctor for the entire population. They could just go once a week. They ended up rioting and destroying the jail. And they had to close. Now, Willacy County ended up with this ginormous debt. And their only solution for them, they sued MTC. Then they dropped the lawsuit. And they bought the property. And they want to enter into agreement again with the same, like with these private entities again. Because the county has so much debt already that they need to find a way to just survive. But they sued, they dropped the lawsuit, and now they're thinking again about entering into agreements with private facilities. So, I think it's just flagging it for you.
Representative Wiley, I'm sorry. Yes.
I know we're towards the end, but I just want to say thank you to all the panelists and for all that you do. I mean, you definitely don't do this to get richer for the money. So I just want to say thank you to all of you, to all the panelists that come and testify before us, particularly ACLU. I know that when we talked about accountability earlier and how do you keep folks accountable is doing those FOIA requests and continue to hammer them, because that's the only way. Sunlight is the best remedy for us, and have forums like this when we don't get a live feed through traditional avenues. We have live feeds in the social media. This is an ability. The good thing sometimes with social media, unfortunately, you have the extreme circumstances, consequences of social media in people like the current president. But I just want to say thank you. Appreciate you, and continue to do that work that we need you guys to do, because it helps us. It arms us with tools to be able to fight back the injustices that are occurring at this point. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to underscore what Representative Wally was talking about, we are duly elected members of the legislature. We are an official caucus of the legislature, and we were prohibited from streaming. We were blocked, we were censored from streaming this in the Capitol and on the public system, because it was perceived as somehow being political, like our quote-unquote border security program or SB4 or any of these other things are not political. We perceive this as being our duty to engage in oversight, and we're grateful for the panelists here, and we're grateful for the millennials who helped us solve for being censored here and leapfrog the local system with Facebook Live. So thank you very much. We're grateful to all the participants, and I know members of the panel who came from San Antonio, from Austin, from El Paso, and from Houston and Dallas are grateful for everyone's participation. Thank you so much. And this hearing is now closed. That was good.